All right, so Unit 3, forming the U.S. Constitution. Now, please remember, the Constitution is our current form of government. So the Articles of Confederation are going to be the first form of government that the United States has after the Treaty of Paris 1783 is signed. Now, remember, they just came out of a really, really bad relationship with Great Britain. So they're going to try to avoid centralized government, which is what the king was. The king was a central government. He was the one that controlled most everything. So the Articles of Confederation was the first government. It was based on the fact that our founding fathers wanted a small government, and because they just got out of a relationship with the British kings. There were 4 major problems with the Articles of Confederation, and all of them boiled down to the fact that the government had no pact, P-A-C-T. So the P stands for president. They didn't have a president. They didn't have a central army. Each state had its own army. They didn't have a Congress. So they didn't have a meeting. Well, they kind of had a meeting, but they didn't have someone to pass laws for the federal government. And they also didn't have taxes that went to the federal government. So each state was in its own debt and had to get out of its own problems, whether it be a tax from Native Americans, whether it be actual debt. Whatever the problem was, each state was in charge of picking up the slack for themselves. So, star question. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 happens after a riot breaks out in the northern states called Shays' Rebellion. This Constitutional Convention was held in Philadelphia, just like the Continental Congresses were. There were 3 major questions that they needed to answer. How would the states and people be represented in a national government? Because they all agreed that the fact that we didn't have a national government under the Articles of Confederation, it wasn't working. So how would we be represented in each state be represented in government? How would slaves be counted as part of the slave population? How would they be represented in government? And how would the president be elected? And there were 2 groups during the Constitutional Convention and ratification. Federalists were for bigger, central, more federal government, and Anti-Federalists were for bigger state governments and a smaller federal government. There were also 2 groups kind of fighting back and forth over each of these 3 major questions that they needed to be answered. Okay. The major author of the Constitution was James Madison. He is known as the father of the Constitution. Now, issue number 1, how would the states and people be represented in national government? The New Jersey plan is a small state plan. They wanted only 1 house in the legislative branch, and they wanted each state to have 1 representative. Now, remember, legislative branch makes laws, right? Legislatures make laws. This way, each state had equal representation. The Virginia plan was a large state plan. They wanted to have a bicameral, which means 2, a 2-house legislature, and they wanted the number of representatives from each state to be based on the population size of each state. Now, since they had more people, they would have more representatives in this legislature, which is why the big states supported the Virginia plan. So, question number 1. Why do you think both of those states chose the plans they did? I kind of gave you the answer to that one. How did each plan benefit the states that came up with it? And number 2, what ways do you think they can come up with a compromise? So given the fact that we have the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan, what's a compromise you can come up with between the 2? All right, the Great Compromise is what happens. They decide on 3 branches of government. They decide on a bicameral legislature for the legislative branch. In it, the first Senate would get 2 representatives per state. So right now, there's 50 states. That means there's a total of 100 senators. And 2, the House of Representatives is the lower house of the legislature. This is based on state population. The more people in a state, the more representatives they have. So, for example, Texas is bigger than Oklahoma in terms of both land and population. But because it's bigger in population, it has way more representatives than Oklahoma has. Issue number 2, would slaves be counted as towards state population? How would they be represented in the federal government? So the southern states are going to want slaves to count towards state population for representation for an obvious reason, right? The northern states are not going to want slaves to count towards state population. They're seen as property. They shouldn't count towards people. So, my next question, why do you think both of these states chose the plans they did? How did each plan benefit them that came up with it? And 2, what ideas can you think of for them to compromise? The 3/5 compromise is going to be how they come up with a compromise for this issue. Each slave is going to count as 3/5 of a person. So for every 5 slaves, the total count towards population is going to be 3 citizens. This is so that way the slave states that have bigger amounts of slave get more people in Congress, get more people in that bicameral legislature. Issue number 3, how is a president going to be elected? The states' rights supporter wanted a direct election by the people, so that means the majority wins in that case. The federal rights supporters wanted the national government to be able to elect the president. They did not want the general public to vote. They did not believe the general public was educated enough to make a voting decision like this, because it was a very, very big decision to put one person in control of this much power. So they came up with the Electoral College. Electors are chosen by state's legislature, and they vote on the president. So realistically speaking, we could vote for president, but realistically speaking, these legislatures, these Electoral College members, could vote any way they want. So I could vote for Trump in this election, but if one of the Electoral College members does not like Trump and he votes for Biden, my vote doesn't matter. His vote matters, or her vote, depending on if the Electoral College member is a man or a woman. Obviously, in this time, they were just men. But the Electoral College is made up of however many votes you get per state. That's the amount of people that vote on the president. So yes, our vote does count in the sense that majority population, they usually go with whatever the majority says. But they can, and there has been cases where the Electoral College members just choose not to, and they go the total opposite way. And that's all I got for this section. We'll have 2 other lectures this unit.